At some point, life stopped feeling close. Not dramatic, not sudden, just distant. You're still here. You still show up. You still do what needs to be done. But it feels like you're watching your life instead of living inside it. You move through days on autopilot. Tasks get done. Conversations happen. Yet there's a quiet separation between you and everything you're doing, as if something shifted, and no one noticed. Most people don't talk about this feeling because it's hard to explain. You're not sad enough to call it depression, not lost enough to call it a crisis, not broken enough to ask for help. So you keep going. At some point, life stopped feeling close. Not dramatic, not sudden, just distant. You're still here. You still show up. You still do what needs to be done. But it feels like you're watching your life instead of living inside it. You move through days on autopilot. Tasks get done. Conversations happen. Yet there's a quiet separation between you and everything you're doing. As if something shifted and no one noticed. Most people don't talk about this feeling because it's hard to explain. You're not sad enough to call it depression, not lost enough to call it a crisis, not broken enough to ask for help. So you keep going, and the distance becomes normal. But this feeling doesn't come from nowhere. It's not laziness, it's not lack of gratitude, and it's not a personal failure. It's often the result of living for too long in survival mode. When life asks too much for too long, you adapt by pulling inward. You narrow your focus. You reduce emotional exposure. You stay functional by disconnecting just enough to cope. At first, this protects you. You become efficient, capable, reliable. But over time, that same adaptation creates distance, not just from others, but from yourself. You stop checking in with how you actually feel. You stop questioning whether your life still fits you. You stop noticing what excites you, moves you, or feels meaningful. Not because you don't care, but because caring feels heavy when you're already carrying too much. So you choose numbness over overwhelm. And numbness is quiet. It doesn't interrupt your routine. It doesn't demand change. It simply creates space between you and your own experience. That's why this distance feels confusing. From the outside, things might look fine, but from the inside, something feels muted. Moments don't land the way they used to. Joy feels distant. Time passes quickly, but nothing feels memorable. And when you try to explain it, the words don't come. So you assume this is just adulthood, just responsibility, just how life becomes. But distance isn't a natural outcome of growing up. It's a response to pressure without pause, to expectations without reflection, to movement without meaning. And the longer it goes unexamined, the more familiar it becomes, until one day you realize you've been present everywhere, except in your own life. Why the distance persists? Distance doesn't stay because you want it to. It stays because it becomes useful. When life feels overwhelming, emotional distance acts like a buffer. It keeps you moving when stopping would force you to feel too much at once. So you stay busy, you stay productive, you stay occupied, not as a choice, but as a coping mechanism. Over time, you begin to measure your days by output instead of experience. What you completed, what you handled, what you survived. And slowly, without realizing it, your inner world becomes quieter, not peaceful, just unattended. You stop asking questions like, is this still right for me? Do I actually want this? Am I present here? Because those questions don't fit into a full schedule, so they get postponed. And postponed long enough, they start to feel irrelevant. Another reason this distance persists is familiarity. Once you've lived disconnected for a while, it becomes your baseline. You don't miss what you can't clearly remember. You remember being more alive, but vaguely, like a memory without details. So the contrast fades. And because nothing is technically wrong, there's no obvious reason to stop and recalibrate. You tell yourself, this is just a phase. I'll feel like myself again when things slow down, when I have more time. But life rarely slows down on its own. It fills the space you give it. And the longer you wait, the harder it becomes to tell whether the distance came from circumstances or from you adapting to them. This is where many people get stuck. They confuse emotional distance with maturity. They confuse numbness with stability. They confuse self-control with self-erasure. They become very good at managing life while feeling increasingly absent from it. And because this state is quiet, it rarely triggers urgency. There's no breakdown, no dramatic moment, no clear signal that something needs attention, just a subtle sense that you're living slightly to the side of your own experience. That's why this distance can last for years, not because you're unaware, but because awareness alone doesn't automatically bring you back. It only shows you where you are. And realizing where you are can feel unsettling, because once you see the gap between living and existing, you can't pretend it's not there anymore. The quiet return. Coming back to yourself doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't arrive as a breakthrough. It doesn't announce itself dramatically. It starts quietly, often in moments that seem insignificant. A pause where you normally rush, a feeling you normally dismiss, a question you allow yourself to sit with instead of pushing away. The return begins when you stop treating distance as something to fix and start seeing it as something to understand. Because this distance didn't appear without reason. It formed while you were adapting, while you were enduring, while you were doing the best you could with what you had. And that matters. You don't reconnect with your life by judging the version of you that learned to disconnect. You reconnect by listening to what that version was protecting you from. Often, the distance softens the moment you stop fighting it. When you allow yourself to notice how you actually feel, without correcting it, without explaining it away, without turning it into a problem that needs immediate resolution, presence returns slowly, not as exciting, not as motivation, but as a subtle sense of being here again. You start noticing details you used to overlook, how your body reacts in certain situations, how your energy changes around certain people, how some environments drain you, while others quietly restore you. These aren't answers, they're signals. And signals only become useful when you give them attention. This is where many people get impatient. They want clarity before presence, direction before awareness, certainty before honesty. But the order matters. You don't find meaning by thinking your way back into it. You find it by being present long enough for it to reappear. The distance didn't mean you lost yourself. It meant you stepped back to survive. And now, slowly, you're noticing that survival no longer needs to be your default state. That realization alone changes something. It doesn't demand immediate action. It doesn't require a new plan. It simply opens space. Space to feel again. Space to question gently. Space to experience your life from the inside rather than observing it from a distance. And that's how the return begins, not with answers, but with attention. There is something important to understand about distance. It doesn't mean you stopped caring. It means you learned how to function without feeling everything at once. And that ability, as costly as it can be, came from strength. You adapted because you had to. You kept going because stopping wasn't an option. You became reliable, composed, capable. But adaptation is not a permanent state. What once protected you can eventually limit you. Not because it was wrong, but because it stayed longer than it was needed. The moment you start noticing this distance, something has already shifted. Awareness is not the end of numbness. It's the beginning of reconnection. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. You don't need to force yourself to feel more. You don't need to reclaim passion overnight. You don't need to figure everything out. You only need to stay present long enough to notice what returns naturally. Closeness doesn't rush back. It arrives quietly, in moments where you're not bracing, not performing, not surviving. And when it does, you realize something simple but important. You were never disconnected from life. You were protecting yourself from it.